Welcome to my YouTube channel at Sci-Fi Tales Pools. Please subscribe, like, and share to support my channel. Princess Claire stood on the polished floor of the docking bay as the heavy doors opened to reveal the mining colony of Orion Gate. The air smelled faintly of metal and dust, and the walls were marked by years of work and struggle. She was not used to such sights. In the royal palace, she lived among gold walls and soft carpets, and now she walked through narrow halls lit by flickering lights. Guards followed her at a distance, but she could feel the eyes of the workers watching her as she passed. The colony was busy with the sound of machines and the voices of people calling to each other. Most kept their heads down as the princess passed, but one young man looked straight at her. His dark hair was a little messy, and his hands were marked with grease. He wore a simple work jacket and carried a toolbox. There was something steady in his gaze, and it made Claire pause for a heartbeat before moving on. A sudden alarm echoed through the hall and thick doors slid shut on both ends, trapping her in a section of the corridor. The guards were on the other side of the doors and could not reach her at once. She turned and saw the young man still there. Seemed calm, as if such things happened often. He set down his toolbox and spoke to her in a tone that was neither fearful nor overly formal. He told her the doors sometimes locked during system checks and that they would open soon. She listened to his voice, and it felt different from the careful words of the court. They stood there in the dim light. He told her his name was Ethan. He worked on the life support systems of the colony. He said the air recyclers were old and always in need of repair. She asked him about the stars he saw from the colony, and he told her that, from here, the sky was filled with red light from the nearby sun, and that sometimes he missed the clear blue skies of Earth. She told him that, from the palace, she could see hundreds of stars at night, but from behind thick glass. He said seeing stars through glass was not the same as standing under them in the open. Claire found herself smiling, which was rare when she spoke to someone outside the royal circle. Ethan seemed to speak from the heart without thinking about how his words might be judged. He asked her if she had ever walked outside on a quiet morning and felt the wind on her face without guards around. She said she had not. He nodded as if that told him much about her life. For a while they spoke of small things. He told her about his work fixing air pumps and sealing cracks in the outer walls. She told him about the gardens in the royal palace and how flowers were grown under artificial sunlight. She noticed that Ethan listened with real interest. There was no hint of flattery. It felt strange and somehow welcome. When the doors finally opened, the guards rushed in and moved quickly to place themselves between her and the worker. She looked back at Ethan before being led away. His eyes met hers again for a brief moment, and she felt something unspoken pass between them. She did not know why it stayed in her mind as she walked back to the royal shuttle, but she knew she would remember it. The sound of the metal doors closing behind her seemed to mark the end of something small, yet important. Princess Claire sat by the wide window of her private room on the royal ship, as it sailed away from the mining colony. The stars outside looked the same as before, yet her thoughts were full of the small, dim room. Where she had met Ethan, she had spoken with him only for a short time. But his words and the way he looked at her stayed in her mind. No one in the palace had ever spoken to her like that. There had been no false praise and no careful choice of words. He had not treated her like a fragile statue, but like a person. Her days returned to the normal pattern of court life: meetings with ministers, filled her mornings banquets and speeches, took her evenings. The voices around her spoke of politics and trade, and never of the lives of the workers. Deep in the mining halls, Claire found herself wishing for the sound of Ethan's voice telling her of the machines and the narrow tunnels of the colony. She remembered the light in his eyes when he spoke of the stars he had seen only twice in his life. It made her heart ache in a way she did not understand. One afternoon, she went to the palace library. She searched the records for reports on Orion Gate and the other far colonies. She read of shortages of food and long working hours. She read of engines that broke down and the men who stayed awake for days to keep the air clean and the lights on. No one in the court spoke of these things, yet here they were in quiet lines of text hidden in the archives. She wondered how many others like Ethan lived their whole lives in places where no window showed the endless sky. Far away, Ethan was also thinking of the princess. He had returned to his duties in the tunnels. The metal floors rang under his boots as he moved from one station to another. His hands were busy with tools, but his mind kept drifting back to the moment.
Ow.
The doors had opened and the guards had taken her away. He told no one about the meeting. He knew they would not believe him, or they would laugh. Yet the memory gave him a strange sense of hope. If a princess could stand in the same room and speak to him as an equal, then perhaps the lines between the high and the low were not as fixed as they seemed. Weeks later, trouble came to Orion Gate. The main reactor that powered the life systems began to fail. The lights dimmed in the tunnels, and the air grew thin. Ethan and the other technicians worked day and night to hold the systems together. Without power, the colony could not survive. Word was sent to the royal fleet for aid. Claire heard of it in a meeting, and her heart beat faster. She asked to join the mission to oversee the help being sent. The king agreed, for it would show the people that the crown cared for all its subjects. When the royal ship reached Orion Gate, the docks were full of workers waiting for news. The halls were darker than before, and the sound of the great machines was slower. Claire walked among the people with a small guard escort. She saw the worry in their faces and the tiredness in their steps. In the control room, she saw Ethan again. He was bent over a console with his sleeves rolled up and his hair damp from sweat. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment the noise of the room seemed far away. Their eyes met, and in that look there was a silent recognition of all that had passed between them in that first meeting. They could not speak for long. Orders were being shouted, and data screens flashed with warnings. Claire stood nearby as Ethan explained to the engineers from the royal ship what repairs were needed. She saw how the others listened to him with respect. He moved with steady purpose, even as the crisis deepened in the rush of work and the low hum of voices. The old distance between princess and workers seemed to fade. Again, that night, the repairs were still not finished. The danger was not over. Yet Claire felt a strange calm knowing that Ethan was there. He had faced the darkness of the tunnels for years and had not lost his strength. She began to think that perhaps her life in the palace had been far smaller than she had ever known. The days after the royal ship arrived were filled with work and little rest. The reactor of Orion Gate was still unstable, and the repairs were slow. The heat deep in the tunnels made every breath heavy. Claire stayed close to the work teams, watching as they labored to keep the systems alive. She wore a plain coat instead of her royal gown, so she could move through the narrow spaces without trouble. She did not care that the floor left marks on her boots, or that the air smelled of metal and smoke. Ethan was at her side more often now. At first, it was only by chance as they moved between workstations. Soon it became clear that he was guiding her to the places where she could see the truth of the colony's life. He showed her the sleeping quarters where 10 men shared one small room. He showed her the storage halls where food was kept in neat rows for the weeks ahead. He took her to the highest platform in the tunnels, where a window looked out on the cold black of space. The stars there seemed sharper and colder than those seen from the palace observatory. She stood beside him in the silence and felt the weight of all the lives depending on the fragile walls around them. One morning, an urgent call came from the upper sector of the colony. A flare from the nearby sun had damaged the outer stabilizers of the royal ship. Without them, the great vessel could not hold its place above the colony. The ship's crew ordered an evacuation of some passengers and supplies to smaller shuttles. In the rush of people and the echo of alarms, Claire found herself pulled toward one of these shuttles, along with Ethan and a few others. The shuttle launched into the black sky and sped away from the failing ship. For a short time, it was smooth. Then a warning light began to flash. The pilot spoke in a hard voice, and the shuttle shook as it entered the thin atmosphere of a nearby moon. It struck the ground with a deep sound and slid along the rough surface, before coming to a halt. Dust rose around them, and the smell of burnt metal filled the air. When the door opened, the group stepped out into a land of jagged crystal towers and deep shadows. The sky was pale, and the wind was sharp against their faces. They had no way to send a signal to the main fleet. The pilot and 2 guards left to search for better ground, while Ethan and Claire stayed with the damaged shuttle. They worked together to make a shelter using pieces of the shuttle's outer panels. Ethan showed her how to place them so the wind would pass around instead of through. He found a narrow cave nearby and led her there to rest from the cold. The ground was hard, but the air inside was warmer than outside. As night fell, the wind grew louder, and the shadows stretched long over the land. They lit a small heat unit and sat beside it. Claire's hands were cold, and she held them close to the light. She looked at Ethan in the glow and saw the lines of wear on his face from years of labor. She reached out her hand to him without a word. He looked at her and for a moment did not move. Her voice was soft when she spoke. "Why do you not take my hand, human?" There was no anger in her tone, only sadness. It was as if she feared he would turn away from her now. Ethan lowered his eyes. He felt the weight of the distance between a princess and a worker, even here on this lonely moon. In his mind, he was still the man who lived in the tunnels, and she was still the daughter of a king. The heat unit flickered, and the night pressed close around them. Neither spoke again for a long time. Yet the air between them was filled with the truth that both could feel. They were far from the palace and far from the mines. Only the cold wind and the wide silence of the moon were there to witness them. The morning on the moon came with a pale light that turned the crystal towers into shapes of glass and fire. The wind had eased, but the cold was still sharp. Ethan woke first and stepped outside the cave to check the land. His boots crunched on the frozen ground, and his breath showed in small clouds. The wreck of the shuttle stood silent under a thin layer of dust. He knew they could not stay there for long without more food and water. Claire came from the cave and stood beside him. Her coat was pulled tight, and her hair moved with the wind. She asked him how far they could walk before the cold became too strong. He told her they would need to travel to the ridge in the distance, where he had seen a dark line that might be a deeper cave or a tunnel. It would give them more shelter, and maybe a way to signal the fleet. They packed what little they had to small packs of food units. A heat unit and a coil of thin rope. The walk was slow, and the ground was rough, sharp stones cut at their boots in the light. From the crystals made the air shimmer. Ethan walked ahead to test each step, while Claire followed close behind. Hours passed and the pale sun moved higher in the sky. They reached the ridge, just as a low tremor shook the ground. The crystals around them gave a strange ringing sound like glass struck by a hammer. Ethan pulled Claire toward the shadow of the ridge as pieces of crystal fell from above. They pressed against the rock until the tremor ended. When it was quiet again, they moved forward and found the mouth of a narrow cave. Inside the cave, the air was warmer and smelled faintly of minerals. The walls were lined with smooth stone instead of sharp crystal. Ethan placed the heat unit near the wall, and they sat beside it. For the first time since the crash, they felt almost safe as they rested. Claire spoke of her life in the palace. She told him of the endless rooms and the wide halls that echoed with the sound of her own steps. She told him how the crown felt heavy not only on her head but in her heart. He listened without turning away. Then he spoke of his own life in the tunnels. He told her of the long days without sunlight and the pride of keeping the colony alive. He told her of the small moments of peace when he could look at the stars and dream of other worlds. The hours in the cave passed slowly. Outside, the light began to fade and the cold grew stronger. They shared a small meal and sat close to the heat unit Claire looked at. Ethan again, as the shadows moved across his face, she remembered the moment the night before, when she had offered her hand. And he had not taken it. She did not speak of it now, but the feeling still rested between them later. A second tremor came, and this one was stronger. The floor shook, and a deep sound rolled through the cave. Ethan moved quickly to shield Claire from falling stones. A sharp crack sounded, and part of the wall broke away. Dust filled the air, and for a moment they could not see. When it cleared, Ethan was holding her close, his arms around her to keep her safe. In that moment, something shifted in him. The distance he had kept because she was a princess began to fall away. She was simply Claire, now a person beside him in a place where titles had no meaning. He kept his arms around her for a moment longer before they sat down again near the heat unit. The night was long and silent after that. The tremors did not return. They sat together, watching the pale glow from the crystal at the mouth of the cave. Neither spoke, but both knew that the barrier between them had grown weaker. The cold outside was still fierce, but inside the cave, there was a small warmth that did not come only from the heat unit. The next day began with a strange stillness on the moon. The wind had stopped, and the sky was clear. The pale sun rose slowly over the crystal towers, and the light filled the cave, where Claire and Ethan had taken shelter. They had slept little, but they both felt stronger than before. Ethan stood at the cave mouth and looked toward the far horizon. In the distance, a faint silver glint moved against the dark sky. He watched it for a long time. Before he was sure it was a ship, called for Claire, and she came to stand beside him. The glint grew larger until the shape of a rescue craft could be seen. They both knew they would soon be taken from this place. They began to gather their few supplies and prepare to leave the cave. As they worked, there was a quiet between them that was not heavy, but full of meaning. The rescue craft landed on a flat space beyond the ridge. Dust rose in a wide cloud, and the sound of the engines filled the air. A team of guards stepped out and hurried toward them. Claire walked with Ethan down the slope and into the open where the team could see them. The guards moved to lead Claire away, but she stopped and turned to face them. She told them she would not leave without the man who had kept her alive. They hesitated and looked at each other, but she did not move. Ethan stood still, unsure if he should speak. He felt the old weight of rank pressing between them again. Yet Claire reached out her hand, and this time he did not pull away. He took her hand in his and held it so all could see. The guards stepped back and let them pass together toward the rescue craft. Inside the craft, the seats were narrow and the walls hummed with the sound of the engines. Claire sat beside Ethan, and for the first time since leaving the palace, she felt no need to pretend. She leaned her head back and let the soft vibration of the flight calm her. Ethan sat quietly, yet his hand still held hers. When they returned to the royal ship, the king was waiting. His face was stern and his voice was cold as he spoke to his daughter. He said the people had been worried, and the crown could not afford such risks. Claire stood tall before him and told him that the risk had been shared, and that the man beside her had faced it with courage. The king looked at Ethan and saw the dirt on his coat. In the lines on his face, he saw no crown, no title, only a worker from a far colony. Yet he also saw the way his daughter's eyes did not leave the man's face. News of the rescue spread quickly across the fleet and then to the far worlds of the kingdom. Images were shown of the princess walking hand in hand with a worker from the mining colony. Some spoke in whispers of scandal, while others called it a sign of hope. In the halls of power, voices rose in anger, but in the streets and tunnels of the colonies, people smiled.
Ow.
Days later, Claire stood again at the great window of the palace ship. This time Ethan stood beside her. The stars outside were the same as always, yet they seemed brighter now. She spoke of the changes she wished to see in the way the crown cared for the far colonies. Ethan listened and gave his own thoughts without fear. They stood together as equals, and the silence between them was warm. In the years that followed, the story of the princess and the worker was told in many places. It became a sign that courage could cross any divide, and that the hand of one person could change the path of another. The people remembered that a princess had once reached out her hand, and that a worker had taken it without bowing his head. And in that simple act, they saw the truth that no wall of rank or birth could stand against the strength of the human heart. Thank you for watching and being part of our community.